Unfriendly waters. An international tribunal rejects China's claims to the South China Sea. We ask where Beijing will go from here. Also in today's program, a landmark transition. The US ends a ban on transgender Americans serving in the military. And in Picture This, anti-corruption protesters in Zimbabwe mean business. Hello and welcome to the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. It's a rivalry that reaches back decades. Disputes over the South China Sea have spanned across countries and continents and have escalated in recent years. China claims sovereignty over the area and has been at the forefront of tensions. Neighboring nations have viewed Beijing as an aggressor, and now they have The Hague to back them up. On Tuesday, an international tribunal ruled that China has no territorial rights to the contested lands and waters. It was in response to a legal case brought forth by the Philippines, the first of its kind. China promptly fired back, saying the decision has no binding force and is just a piece of paper. Today's newsmaker is the South China Sea, as we ask if the recent Hague ruling will change China's attitude towards the disputed waters.
The South China Sea, the source of Asia's largest territorial dispute, with competing claims of ownership across the region, and China claiming rights to most of it. But an international tribunal has ruled Beijing's assertions are legally baseless. In a case brought by the Philippines, the Permanent Court of Arbitration in The Hague found China's claims to territorial sovereignty and its efforts to enforce them violate international law. It also found China had breached the Philippines' sovereignty, interfered with its fishing rights, and created a risk of collisions between vessels in the area.
The Philippines strongly affirms its respect for this milestone decision.
The 9-dash line. It's been used by China for decades as evidence that it controls territory in the South China Sea, including the Paracel and Spratly Islands. The surrounding waters are rich fishing grounds, and it's thought there could be oil and gas reserves there. At least 6 other countries also have claims in the region, and these all conflict and overlap. China has been accused of gunboat diplomacy in asserting its claims, and has built artificial islands and military installations in the disputed waters. The South China Sea is a vital shipping route, with $5 trillion worth of trade flowing through each year. So everyone hopes this ruling will ensure the stability of the region.
I hope the award is now used to create a positive momentum in finding a solution.
We insist that it is absolutely vital that all countries abide by international law.
We believe both China and the Philippines should follow the ruling.
But given China's reaction, that seems unlikely.
This afternoon, the tribunal for the Philippines South China Sea case made an illegal, null and void, and so-called final ruling.
The Chinese people will never accept this arbitration case.
The Philippines' claim of sovereignty are baseless.
To China, this ruling is illegal and invalid, and will have no effect on its territorial sovereignty or maritime rights. Beijing says it doesn't want to escalate tensions in the region. But China has also said it has the right to set up air defence over what it believes is its territory. While the ruling is binding, it has no power of enforcement. If China can dismiss a ruling on international law, does it mean anything? And will it just escalate tensions further? Yvette McCullough, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now to discuss the latest South China Sea dispute developments from London is Bill Hayton, the author of South China Sea, The Struggle for Power in Asia. And joining us from New York is Anne Lee, author of the book, What the US Can Learn from China. Thanks both of you for joining us. Anne Lee, let me start with you. Why can't China accept this ruling? Because it sounds like sour grapes.
Well, China believes that it was not a fair ruling. They weren't really participating in it. And this ruling basically doesn't make any decisions about sovereignty. So the previous comments about it are actually not factually correct here. The ruling basically said it doesn't determine sovereignty nor what the boundaries are for the sovereign nations and how they would delimitate that. It's really mostly about economic zones around those areas and then what constitutes an island. And I guess China and Taiwan as well feel that it was extremely biased. The fact that they had ruled that Taiping is not an island seems to support their belief because previously many other people have agreed that that was an island. It has supported Taiwan's people there for many days without sustenance and support from outside. Many experts who have weighed in already have agreed that they were extremely surprised how far that ruling went because everyone else did not expect them to say that that island was downgraded to rocks.
Let me ask you a little bit about legitimacy here, because this is not really a kangaroo court. It is a UN-backed tribunal in The Hague. It's a permanent court of arbitration. The Philippines sued under the International Law of Sea Treaty, or UNCLOS, which China had ratified. So it had played along and respected the court up until it made a decision that China didn't like. So isn't it a little disingenuous now that China comes out and says, oh, this is nothing, this is just a piece of paper, when beforehand it recognized this court and it recognized its legitimacy?
Well, yes, that makes it difficult for China to completely dismiss it, and I would believe that China will continue to try to work with the other parties around it. But let's remember, other great powers like the U.S. Had dismissed international law as well. So the U.S. was part of the UN, and yet,
we're talking
it
about
went
China.
and invaded Iraq and other things.
That's
and
fine,
so,
but we're not talking about the Iraq war. We're talking about China.
No, I understand, but I'm just saying that making an analogy that, yes, it's going to be a calculation on their part whether it serves their best interest to go along with it, or they would make a calculation that this was, in fact, politically unfair and not in their best interest. And so we will see how they will behave.
Okay, let's try and look at this response again. Bill Hayton, some of the responses that have come out of China, particularly in the public media, in the English language, we have more access to China's response nowadays. No jurisdiction, no legal basis. CCTV had this headline, indisputable sovereignty. Xinhua, in all caps, tweeted out, no binding force. Are they overreacting a bit, or do they have a case, Bill?
Well, it's important, I think, to understand that in the South China Sea disputes, there are two kinds of disputes. There are disputes about the islands, and then there are disputes about the spaces in between the islands. And this case said nothing at all about the disputes about the islands. It didn't say anything about sovereignty, as Anne was just saying. It didn't say anything about who's the rightful owner of the Paracels and the Spratlys. What it was saying was who has the right to extract resources from the seas around the islands. And in particular, does this U-shaped or 9-dash line that China drew back in 1947 on its maps, does that actually have any legal force? And the conclusion of the tribunal was that it has no legal force, that a country can't simply draw a line on a map and say all the fish and all the oil in this water belongs to us. You have to actually have an island or a coastline, and then you have to measure a certain distance from that. Yeah. So China's sovereignty claim is still intact. What I find interesting is that either China completely misunderstands what this case has been about, or China is deliberately trying to distract attention by focusing on the sovereignty question and ignoring the resource question.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And I wonder, Bill, who gets to enforce it? Nobody gets to enforce this, right? So if nobody gets to enforce this ruling, how much of a victory can this really be for the Philippines beyond the symbolism? Because nobody would want to take on China, would they?
Well, I mean, in theory, let's think how one scenario could unfold. And this is just a scenario. So, for example, there's believed to be quite a lot of natural gas underneath a bit of the sea known as the Reed Bank. This ruling now says that China has no claim, and no other country has any claim to this bit of seabed except the Philippines. So the Philippines now has a piece of paper that says you can take your gas rig and you can go and drill for gas on this bit of sea. Now, China may disagree with them. China could send its Coast Guard ships to try and physically bash into the Philippine oil rig and try and push it away, for example. Well, in that case, China would be acting in violation of an international court ruling, and that ruling is binding, just like all international courts are. The question is, who's going to do anything about it? So does the Philippines send its navy, which is obviously much, much smaller, much weaker than China's, to take on China? Perhaps, but probably not. But but the Philippines does have a defense agreement with the United States, which doesn't cover the disputed islands, but it does cover the safety of, for example, of the Philippine Navy. So if this was the case, then the Philippine Navy, which felt it was under threat from the Chinese Navy, might call in its big friend, the United States, to come and protect its Navy. And we could see the two navies going head to head. I think this is very unlikely because I don't think anybody wants this kind of confrontation to happen.
Yeah,
but that's the way you could
right.
get some kind of enforcement. Exactly, right. Exactly. So I think at the moment the best thing is that nobody does anything. Nobody does any drilling and let everybody kind of calm down.
And are we seeing a conflict of purpose here? So you have China on the one hand, which wants strategic hegemony, dominance. It's looking at the United States and its pivot to Asia. The fact that the United States controls so much of the Pacific and beyond. So that's China's goal. On the other hand, you have the Philippines, which is just sort of more hand to mouth, and it's more interested in the actual fishing. It's more interested in something much more basic. Is that a clash of two very different visions and different purpose from the different countries?
Well, I think that the clash is really between China and the U.S. Before the Asia pivot, there was really no major disputes going on in that area. All these disputes suddenly hit headlines, back in, say, 2013 or so after the Asia pivot was announced. And so China's suspicions are that the U.S. was behind a lot of the tension that's going on, whereas China was quite willing to work with its neighbors, and China had no reason to block trade going through that area. I mean, the freedom of navigation is sort of an irrelevant thing to China because China depends on all that trade, so why would they choose to block it in the first place? I think China actually was very threatened by military ships going through there because that actually is more threatening to China, and that was what was, China's, I guess, reason for opposing what was going on there and starting to build military installations because they were reacting to what the Philippines and the Vietnamese were already doing.
So let me ask Bill. Let me ask Bill if he thinks that has any relevance.
China was actually
sure. Let me ask him if he feels this idea, the suspicion of the Chinese, that the United States is using countries like the Philippines as a sock puppet in the geopolitics of the area. Is there any truth to that, Bill?
Well, I would put it the other way around, to be honest. I think the Southeast Asian countries have sought to pull the United States back into the region. I would disagree with Anne on this point because Southeast Asian countries began to be concerned about China's behavior in the South China Sea a long time before the pivot started. And I would specifically say that in 2007, 2008, 2009, this is when the concern really began to surface, because that was in 2007, 2008, that was when Chinese diplomats were going around pressurizing Western and Japanese and American oil companies and British oil companies to pull out of their development projects in the South China Sea. So, for example, BP here in London, the Chinese ambassador at the time, Madame Fu Ying, went and threatened BP and said if they don't pull out of Vietnam, then their investments in China will be affected. And other messages were sent by Chinese diplomats in Texas and in Tokyo and in Singapore. And that's the point, I think, that Southeast Asian governments started to be worried. And in 2008, 2009, they were lobbying the United States to come and take a greater interest in the South China Sea. And when China put forward a map, its 9-dash line map, to the United Nations in May 2009, that really was the last straw. That's when this kicked off, and it was China that started it.
Okay, so and the Chinese started it. It's those other countries that are turning to the U.S. and saying, hey, help us out. What do you think?
Well, I guess from China's perspective, if they continue to believe that area is their sovereign area, then they would clearly behave that way, right? It's just like the U.S. would say, yeah, the shores off of San Diego are part of U.S. territory, and would be extremely offended if China started drilling oil there. And so, again, it does not satisfy, the Hague decision has not ruled on sovereignty. And so if indeed China has sovereign rule over these areas, then China still would believe that this is their right to exercise this kind of influence over that territory. And so we haven't yet satisfied who really owns these islands at this point. But it seems like it's just going to be about gunboat diplomacy again.
Okay.
And so I don't know if this is really going to settle anything.
Okay, let's hope this all ends well and we don't have World War III as was suggested earlier on. Bill and Anne, unfortunately we are out of time, but thank you very much for joining us. Still to come on the Newsmakers, Out of the Shadows, we speak to a transgender Air Force veteran on the impact of the US military recognizing the T in LGBT. And in Picture This, Zimbabwe cracks down on the man behind its largest protests in decades. When the US repealed its military's Don't Ask, Don't Tell policy more than 5 years ago, gay rights activists had much reason to celebrate. While a landmark decision for gay, lesbian and bisexual service members, the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell did little to lift the thousands of transgender service members from out of camouflage. That all changed last month when the US formally announced that transgender individuals can now openly serve in the country's armed forces. The Newsmakers' Randolph Nogel has more.
I'm announcing today that we're ending the ban on transgender Americans in the United States military. Effective immediately, transgender Americans may serve openly, and they can no longer be discharged or otherwise separated from the military just for being transgender.
The United States has joined 18 other countries in allowing transgender people to serve openly in the military. Transgender usually describes people who don't identify with their gender at birth. The decision drew criticism from conservatives, including Congressman Mac Thornberry, Republican chairman of the House Armed Services Committee. He accused the White House of prioritizing politics over policy. The key question in evaluating the shift was whether an inclusive policy would compromise military readiness. Ultimately, the answer was no.
What the commissioners found is that the Pentagon's rationale for firing transgender troops is not based on compelling medical reasons or data.
Estimates suggest there are as many as 12,600 transgender people serving in the U.S. military, out of a total 2 million active and reserve service members.
Fear that someone will find out my secrets.
The policy shift has been studied for years, with the U.S. military looking at how other countries manage the transition within their military ranks.
We're already here, we're already serving, and we always have been. It's just now that it's been put on paper that they have to show us dignity.
The U.S. military has never been an instrument of social change. Rather, it's adapting to a society that's increasingly accepting a part of itself that's always been there.
There has been this incredible shift in attitudes across the country. You know, when I became president, same-sex marriage was legal in only 2 states. Today it's legal in 37 states. But we know that transgender persons still face terrible violence and abuse.
While the LGBT community is still vulnerable to vicious attacks, there have been great strides in gaining acceptance. A military open to all its citizens, regardless of sexual or gender preference, is surely one of them.
The real heroes are those transgender service members, men and women who came out to their commands during the last 2 years that pushed this issue along.
Randolph Nogle, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from St. Louis to discuss the Pentagon's decision to lift the ban on transgender troops is Bryn Tannehill. She served as a pilot in the U.S. Air Force and now advocates for transgender rights in the military. Thanks so much for joining us, Bryn. How much of a personal victory has this been for you?
Well, for me, this is a little bit too late. I had to leave the service in order to transition, but I have continued to work on this issue for other people who continue to serve so that they can do it openly.
You left and then you transitioned. Do you, sometimes after last month's ruling, do you wish you were born a few years later?
Absolutely. There has been incredible gains for the transgender community here in the United States. So many more opportunities, so many more protections. And for a lot of these folks that are just starting their transitions here, they're going to have the opportunity to do it in an environment where they are actually supported and embraced.
Mm-hmm. You talk about an environment of being supported and embraced. There has been opposition since last month. The Center for Military Readiness says the Pentagon is involving itself in, quote, social engineering, and they consider being transgender a pathology, right? So the decision's been made. It's not going to be reversed, but can we maybe expect a fair amount of awkwardness and because a lot of people don't accept the decision, so you still might find many transgender people don't enlist or don't come out because they still fear awkwardness, they fear opposition, they fear persecution?
I don't think that that's going to be nearly as prevalent as one might think. Given that how well things have gone integrating lesbians and gays into the military, given that there has been no noticeable effect on morale, readiness, recruitment, or retention based off of adding lesbian, gay, and bisexual personnel, the military has added people over time, whether it was blacks or women at the service academies or lesbians and gays, and there's always been pushback, but in the end it's always, in retrospect, been the right thing to do. And this is absolutely no different than those times in the past when the military has brought in new people and created a more open environment for people to serve based off of their abilities.
Mm-hmm. Something that's fascinating is the stats. When I was looking at the stats of just how many transgender people there are in the military. So now you have the one stat which suggests 12,600 people are transgender out of the 1.3 million active military personnel. On the other hand, you have low estimates of 2,500, and all along that spectrum, you have these stats in between. Is that an indication that this is still something that's not quite out in the open yet, that the stats are so variable?
Well, some of it is how the stats are collected based off of how many people are in the active duty, the guard, the reserve, the individual ready reserve. So some of what you're looking at is comparing simply active duty with the total force. So the low number of 2,000 is active duty only. The high number of 12 to 14,000 is if you include active duty, guard, reserve, and the inactive reserve. So there is a little bit more agreement than that spread might suggest because they're looking at slightly different things. However, we do know that there are 500 members in the organization that I'm a part of, which is Sparta, and most of these individuals are active duty, guard, or reserve, so they are people who are currently in uniform. So we expect that there will be probably thousands of people that end up being part of our organization.
Mm-hmm. Bryn, it's been really interesting talking to you. Thank you very much for joining us. Bryn Tannehill joining us there from St. Louis. In today's Picture This, a Zimbabwe court has dismissed a case against a pastor who sparked anti-government protests. It comes as the nation is facing a deteriorating economy and sky-high unemployment. Let's take a look.
This government will ignore the citizens at their own peril.
Today's newsmaker has been the South China Sea. We asked if a recent Hague ruling against Chinese sovereignty claims will change the nation's attitude towards the contested waters. Tuesday's international ruling largely invalidates China's historic claims to the area. The South China Sea holds economic significance, supplying a major shipping route, fishing grounds, and could hold reserves of valuable natural resources. Chinese President Xi Jinping dismissed the ruling, saying it won't impact the country's activities. The US is already trying to calm the waters, urging other Asian nations not to aggressively capitalize on the ruling just yet. You've been watching this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. As always, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.